I much appreciate all of you coming out this evening. It's such an important topic. I have come up from London. I spent 20 years working in finance for large fund management companies. I was on the green side, but I was obviously intrigued by what was happening around climate and climate change. And 10 years ago, I set up my research think tank. And can we have the first slide? The other week, the International Energy Agency announced that there are more people working in green jobs than there are working in the fossil fuel industry. The speed of the transformation really is what I think is going to, those of us who care about climate, gives us a lot of hope, because we've got all the technologies we need. We've got all the capital we need. We've got to put it together with the right policy to make sure that we get. Okay, and the next one? Okay, to get to where we want to be. So my presentation is broken into three parts. Where are we? Why have we got the problem in finance that we can see? We just heard from what's happening with the Scottish pension funds investing in the fossil fuel industry. So a little bit about that. And I'm going to talk about why the big oil and gas companies are taking us in the wrong direction from a financial point of view, from a business point of view. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the technologies, which I think are going to be the ones that are going to dig us out of the mess that we're in. So why are we where we are? Now, I think if you're members of Friends of the Earth and you care about climate, you're going to know all of this already. But I'm just going to set out some of the obvious points. What you're looking at is the emissions into the atmosphere from burning coal, oil, and gas over the last 70 years. And you'll see this huge spike. And just to remind ourselves, we have put all of the CO2 in the atmosphere just in that very narrow period of time. And we have changed the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, so it's the highest it's been in over 800,000 years. Now, when you do it in a very narrow period of time, it's difficult to sort of say what the dramatic consequences of it are. But what we know from the science is that within the next 50 years, within this century, we're likely to see us going over 2 degrees, which we've not seen certainly in around 4 million years. London was a steamy swamp. I don't know what Glasgow was hundreds of thousands of years ago, but London was a steamy swamp, which is why they found alligators and they found lions and so on in the underneath London, which from the fossils, which just tells us how easy it is to change our environment, to change the planet. And in previous years, millennia, of course, it was like that. But for 20, 30,000 years, we've got a stable system, and we're disrupting that. That's why we're concerned with the challenge we've got. So why does this relate to finance, and why does this relate to business? What you're looking at here, I want to look at the top right. We measure the amount of carbon dioxide being emitted each year in gigatons. It's 41 gigatons. That's millions of tons of carbon dioxide. And the scientists tell us we can't put more than 300 gigatons of CO2 into the atmosphere before we go above 1.5 degrees Celsius. And a little bit more above that, we get to 2 degrees. If we're emitting 41 gigatons a year, that tells us that we'd go through 1.5 degrees, which we've not seen for all these, tens of thousands of years. We're going to go through that within about, the conditions for it within 8 years' time, in about 8 years' time. And 2 degrees, probably about another 20 to 30 years. So it's very relevant, it's very important. We've got to cut emissions by 50% within 10 years to have any chance of avoiding a very dangerous environment within the next 50, 60, 70 years. Doesn't mean that in 10 years' time we're going to see the worst effects. It just means we've created the conditions for it. I wish it wasn't like that, but it's where we are. Kind of the next slide. So how does this relate to financial markets and the fossil fuel companies owned by the Strathclyde pension scheme and other pension schemes in Scotland? Well, what we did when I had my job in the city, what we did is we took the world's top 200 coal, oil and gas companies, like Shell, like Exxon, like BP. They have fossil fuel reserves, oil reserves, and we added it all up, and we measured how much CO2 that they own in their reserves, and we did it stock exchange by stock exchange. What you're actually looking at there is bubbles linked to stock exchanges. So there's the UK, just to slide to the right, some other European centres in the middle, and I've got the US, and then also Russia's on the far right. So 3 financial centres are the ones that own most of the fossil fuels listed on stock markets, and there's London. smack bang in the middle, one of the world's largest funders of the fossil fuel system. Most of that has to stay underground. We called that the carbon bubble, and that helped me launch Carbon Tracker 10 years ago. And that's when I first got to meet Bill McKibben, who we just saw, and he launched the divestment movement, and Carbon Tracker's analysis, this very simple piece of analysis, became a major driver for the fossil fuel divestment movement. And then a few years after that, Mark Carney asked me to present the analysis to something called the Financial Stability Board, and he came out with his own conclusions. The carbon budget renders the vast majority of reserves stranded. Oil and gas and coal will be literally unburnable. The abrupt transition to a low-carbon future is a financial stability risk. So there we had financial regulators, the ex-head of the Bank of England, and other financial regulators around the world saying, look, if most fossil fuels have to stay in the ground, and pension funds have some of these companies like Shell as the biggest holdings in their fund, and we've got to get off fossil fuels, that creates a huge financial risk. The case for divesting from fossil fuels, though we need them today, is that we're not going to need them in the future. So when I published this analysis, all these other people working in the city started to publish their own reports, stranded assets in Standard Life, which is now Aberdeen, and City and HSBC, joined us in the analysis, and this analysis then started to go out to all the big pension funds. And then I ended up presenting to various funds around the UK and the US about the need to get off of fossil fuels because of the risks. And so when we first published it in 2011, Unusable Reserves, it's hot air, a report by Carbon Tracker that said most of the world's stock of hydrocarbons could never be burned if we were to avoid runaway climate change, has been met with widespread skepticism. And yet, because of the divestment movement and us getting the analysis out there, of the recent ideas campaigners have come up with to convince us to do more about global warming, none's been more potent than the concept of stranded fossil fuel assets. The carbon bubble drives debate, and then the city started to realize that actually there's a contradiction at the heart of the business model of some of these largest fossil fuel companies. If you can't burn what you've got, why are we still raising more money to invest in fossil fuel expansion, like the Canberra project and many other projects like that? It doesn't make any sense. So why is this again a financial risk? Well, we reckon that about half of the world's bond markets, non-bank bonds, are linked to the fossil fuel system: cement, steel, aviation, shipping, oil and gas, and around a quarter of equity markets. These are the two big things that pension funds own: shares, equities, and bonds. If we're to transform our economy, this creates all kinds of risks, as we're going to have to write down the value of these assets. We're going to have to pay for cleanup costs, and each of these companies are going to have to pivot their business model. Well, the UK started a little bit earlier. The US was a little bit late, but they weren't too late to the argument. About a year ago, the Wall Street Journal published this headline: trillions in assets will be left stranded as companies address climate change. Write-down of power plants, auto factories, and fossil fuel reserves could cause big losses in a transition to renewables. One of the things that we've often said, if you work in finance, is it's easier to save a pound than to make a pound. One of the jobs of people looking after the pension fund in Strathclyde or any other pension scheme in Scotland or anywhere else, actually, come to think of it, what their job is to make sure that the scheme doesn't lose money. If you can make money, terrific, but don't lose money. And when you've got so much exposure to fossil fuels and the fossil fuel system in your pension fund, the need to pivot and transition is ever more demanding. So what does this mean for companies whose strategies are based on fossil fuel demand growth? Let's have a look at that. Well, to be clear, the world's leading energy authority, the International Energy Agency, their head, Fatih Birol, has said, if the world is to avoid 1.5 degrees, no new investment is needed in any more coal, oil, or gas expansion. And the IEA demands no new investment to reach a groundbreaking net zero plan. And yeah, I think I mentioned Cambo. There's an oil and gas company up here called Neptune, which is an aggregation of all of Scotland's offshore oil and gas projects, the ones that others have been selling. that as we speak today, the bankers are looking to list it on the London Stock Exchange. So we know that we can't develop anymore, and we can't burn anymore, but still the bankers, supported by pension funds that still invest in fossil fuels, are planning to do even more financing. So the reason for that is, and this is a model of oil and gas growth and demand. There's the 1960s there on the bottom left, accelerated expansion through the 90s and the noughties, and they're assuming, these on the right there, you've got BP, you've got the IEA, what they call their current policy scenario, you've got Wood Mackenzie, and you've got Citi, the bank, and others, all forecasting higher oil and gas demand. So the bankers are saying, well, look, if the world's wants more oil and gas, okay, let's prepare for it. Let's continue to put more money to work in oil and gas. And yet, if we're to get to this magical target of net zero and avoiding the worst effects of climate change, we've got to cut oil production by 3% per annum. That's why investing in more fossil fuels doesn't make any sense. Okay, well, I don't want to get into too much detail on this, but those of you, and I know that some people are here, part of the Strathclyde pension scheme, everyone knows about the traffic light system. You know about the traffic light system, develop it. You do? Okay, so what they're saying in the traffic light system is the oil and gas companies, and what you got there in the middle is a list of the world's major oil and gas companies. What they're saying is that they're fine, they're all Paris aligned. So carbon tracking, we went through all the plans, and I'm only putting up this there to show that we've actually done the work. It's a bit like, being back at college. We have done the analysis, and what we've done is we've looked at all their plans, and the red is the projects being planned by companies like BP and Shell that take us into the 3 degrees territory, 3 degrees of warming. And the yellow are the projects that they're developing, which take us above 2 degrees. And then the blue are the ones that take us above 1.75. Now, why haven't I got 1.5 in there? For the simple reason that there are no projects needed under 1.5. None of these companies should be investing in more oil and gas. And you can download this off Carbon Tracker's website, the Absolute Impact Report, and we're updating it again. Brilliant. So we can sometimes call these carbon bombs, and we've analyzed to 1.6 degrees pathway all the oil and gas spending to 2030 by these companies like Chevron and Total and Exxon. Most of their capital investment is taking the world beyond where we need to be. So here's the headlines, and there we go. Here's the companies who have said that they're on a pathway to net zero, all announcing more oil and gas production and expansion plans. So it's a bit of a contradiction, isn't it? That they're saying we want to get to net zero. We've had oil and gas companies saying that they're part of the solution, and yet we're certainly heading in the wrong direction. And there's some political leadership in Scotland. Nicola Sturgeon says continued oil and gas extraction is wrong. And the COP summit that was up here for last year says we need a just transition as we phase out from fossil fuels. Now, my view, looking at the potential for North Sea wind, is Scotland should be and will be a huge exporter of clean energy to the rest of the United Kingdom, in the same way that it was with oil and gas. That's the opportunity really for the future, is that rapid expansion. So that's what's going on in the oil and gas companies. Now I want to look at some technologies. If CO2 wasn't a problem and it was a benign molecule, would the world still stop using oil and gas? And the answer to that question is absolutely it would, for a very simple reason. That fossil fuels are more expensive today than renewables. It wasn't true 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago, but today it's true that the cheapest source of energy around in most of the world is wind and solar, and even when you add in battery storage, these represent the technology of the future. And what you're looking here is, on these curves coming down, is how the costs of solar energy have just continued to fall and fall and fall. And the same with onshore wind and offshore wind. Nuclear energy, I'm afraid, is not a technology that's got cheaper, not yet anyway, but most of the technologies that are truly renewable, in my view, such as wind and solar and storage and pump storage, hydro, have just got cheaper and cheaper. So that sets us in a direction, which is that when a technology is cheaper, we can begin to see how our entire energy system is changing. We're moving from a fossil fuel-based system, which dominates today, to a renewable energy system. And these may not be statistics you see on day to day, but my team and colleagues, we've been gathering it. This looks at wind and solar. Sorry, some of the numbers have jumbled. This looks at the rapid growth globally in supply of wind and solar. There's annual electric vehicle sales, which are growing at 50 to 60% per annum. And on the right there, you've got annual battery sales. By 2030, so 8 years' time, 7 years' time, we will have built as much wind and solar capacity as the world has built gas and coal-fired power capacity over the last 80 years. That goes to show how fast it's being built. Next slide, please. And it isn't just happening in Denmark and Scotland and other parts of the United Kingdom. This is happening all over the world. It's happening in Brazil, it's happening in Vietnam, it's happening in India, it's happening in China. We hear all about the continued use of coal in China, but China is building vast amounts of wind and solar. And this is a clean energy revolution that is unstoppable because it's the cheapest source of energy. Again, oh, look at that. Okay, so where my slides moved over, that showed countries like Denmark on the right, but I'm afraid you've lost them all. But I'm making a very simple point. Skeptics have been hoping for years that something would stop the deployment of renewable energy, whether it's intermittency, the lack of the right minerals, grid codes, all of these were meant to act as a ceiling for growth. But we found solutions for all of these, and the ceiling of the possible is therefore constantly rising. Meanwhile, countries are far below the ceiling of the possible. But what this shows you on the right is how countries have gone from, I mean, sometimes people say, well, the maximum amount of renewable energy you can put on the grid is 20% of all the electricity because it's so unstable. But countries like Denmark, which is the one up there on the top right, 70% of all their energy is met by renewables. And over the summer in the UK, as much as 60% of the UK's energy needs were met by wind and solar. So electric vehicles, well, if you can get hold of one, they're a bit expensive, but if you can get hold of one, it's really the popular sale for car fleets and for individual cars is electric vehicles. And again, there's the orange line, that's the global car fleet, and by the next 10, 15, 20 years, we expect that most cars being sold out to new customers will be electric vehicles. And the United Kingdom, we put a ban, and the EU has put a ban on the sale of the internal combustion engine car by 2035. I wouldn't be surprised if some countries bring it forward to 2030. So here are the companies, what I've said, here are the companies planning to produce more oil and gas. The only use it's not the only use, but an awful lot of oil goes into cars. But if all the cars on the road are going to become electric vehicles, why are the companies investing in more oil production? Where's going to be the demand for their products? About 20 million cars on the road is equal to about 500,000 barrels of oil demand a day. Who's going to be using all this oil as people start to drive electric vehicles and move away from the traditional internal combustion engine? That really is the question which the oil companies can't answer. And so on the right there, we've got total petroleum used by passenger cars in millions is set to fall dramatically. You can see the fall over the next 10, 20 years as the electric vehicle car fleet grows. Now, once you've paid for your car, the running costs are relatively cheap. If your electricity comes from your roof, it's the cheapest form completely. If you have to buy it through the grid, today it's expensive because electricity is still charged using the price of gas. But if we can get electricity made by renewables and your car is electric, running your electric vehicle is so much cheaper than running an internal combustion engine because there aren't as many moving parts as a traditional car. Next slide, please. Now, people say, well, it's going to take ages for people to switch to electric vehicles. Well, or clean technologies like ground source heat pumps. But we've seen technologies like this before over the years. On the right there, you've got the rapid adoption of railways, the telegraph, of canals, and these are S-curves of growth. And the same is true of the mobile phone, the electric Hoover, the dishwasher. These are all technologies which, once launched, had very rapid adoption. So we're moving very quickly from an old system built on fossil fuels to a system driven by wind and solar. A heat pump, 300% more efficient than a gas boiler. An electric vehicle, 400% more efficient than the internal combustion engine. And so these efficiency gains, cheaper, more reliable, more efficient, delivering more energy per pound spent, is what is driving this clean energy revolution. Next slide, please. So, technologies. I thought I'd put this up here just to remind us how in the past others have said, well, these things will never take off. And it's the same with the trains and the telephones. This was Western Union to Bell when he turned up with the patents for his phone. What use could a company make of an electrical toy? Of course, telephones were almost immediately adopted. Oil. This was prospective drillers to a company in the mid-1850s. Drill for oil, you mean drill into the ground and trying to find oil? You're crazy. Advice to Henry Ford with the car. The horse is here to stay, but the automobile is only a novelty, a fad. And on computers, the chairman of IBM, I think there's a market for about 5 computers. History is riddled with stories of people saying technologies that won't take off. The one that I predict, I think, will be huge within the next 10 years is air source heat pumps. So an air source heat pump is a bit like a reverse refrigerator, puts heat into your home. They're quite expensive, £7,000 to £8,000 a year. But your gas boiler will cost you £1,500, maybe £200 to buy, but it's going to cost you the same again to run for a year. A ground source heat pump, or an air source heat pump rather, when we can get them down to about £2,000 a year, or the same price as a gas boiler, and their running costs are in the hundreds of pounds, why wouldn't you want to have an air source heat pump in your home? Of course you would want to have one, along with an electric vehicle, an electric battery in your car. Okay, so as I get towards the end of my presentation, and I can see that I've really lost some of the wording on here. Let's go back to what investors are thinking. So you've tied all this money up of your pension fund in an old fossil fuel system. We know that a new system is arriving. It's renewable, it's cleaner, it's cheaper, it's more efficient. And yet you've got to decide, do you keep your pension fund invested in fossil fuels? Well, I regret to say today, most investors are still stuck with a fossil fuel system. Most of their capital is tied up in a fossil fuel system. But this is all on the cusp of change. On the green there represents capital, the amount of capital invested in fossil fuels, but fossil fuel capital is at the very peak and is about to decline, and in comes the renewables. Renewables is where the growth is, ladies and gentlemen. This is where the pension funds should be placing their bets. Next slide, please. And the growth of renewables inevitably means a decline in demand for fossil fuels. It's new technology that sets the speed of change, not the old. And the very size of the fossil fuel system makes it extremely vulnerable to this type of disruptive change. There's no debate that we're going to still need fossil fuels over the next decade or so, but the point is we need much less of it today as renewables takes over. And a good indicator of this is coal. We don't use coal in the UK anymore. I mean, I remember when I was at university joining, collecting and shaking a can for out on the street as a student for the miners' strike, thinking, well, United Kingdom's got a huge opportunity to continue with coal. But that's changed very dramatically in 40 years. And even the UK, having coal-fired power stations 10 years ago was still common. Today, no one's generating any power in the UK from coal. And it's true over the OECD, it's dropped by about 5%. Oh, the critical number has been lost in the United States about the amount that's gone down, and also that number is wrong. But the point is, next slide, point is that demand for coal has collapsed. The same thing's going to happen with other fossil fuels. And China, there's the race up the renewables S-curve, electric vehicle sales, solar and wind, and the final energy used in industry. I'm trying to give a positive story here because I genuinely believe this, next slide please, that this revolution is happening, and this will lead to very dramatic falls. There's the global coal demand and oil demand and gas demand, very dramatic falls in fossil fuel use over the next few years. So why do pension funds and investors stick with the same? I think probably, as we are today, you've got oil at $100 a barrel or just below. You've got gas making huge profits. And so investors thinking, well, it's a glory time to be in oil and gas, even though this is such a narrow period of a mismatch between supply and demand caused by the Ukrainian crisis. And so companies like Shell and Exxon continue to invest most of their money in more oil and gas production. Shell last week announced that of the capital investments it was going to make, somewhere around 10 to 15% was going to be in renewables, which means that 85% was more in fossil fuels. So you've got hubris born of success, and then undisciplined pursuit for more, and a denial of risk and peril. In comes the EVs, in comes demand destruction. No one's using coal. Everyone, renewables being the cheapest, but you've still got CEOs who think that this represents the future. Well, ultimately, I think they will capitulate into irrelevance and then ultimately death as a business. But the world is littered with companies that have gone through the same thing. Kodak, you know, Kodak had a digital film division 15, 20 years ago. They sold it because they didn't think it had its future. And they said, we're going to double down on the traditional film. Who uses Kodak film? Maybe some specialist photographers, but most of us, we use our iPhone or a digital camera. The typewriter, well, I grew up in a household with a typewriter. Why didn't Olivetti typewriters become IBM? Or why didn't they become Microsoft? Blockbuster, remember going to the video shop. Why didn't Blockbuster become Netflix? Very simply. And this is true of how investors think. They look at a dominant company, Blockbuster, there was one on every street. And the idea that new technology could come and replace it. And I think this is really the mindset of a lot of investors in the fossil fuel industry, where history is likely to repeat itself. So I'm just going to summarize on these last points. The supply shock of Putin's war will eventually fade. And when it's over, the energy environment is going to be very different. If investors, the pension scheme in Strathclyde, has to prepare for a period of huge disruption and volatility. Banks are going to face what investors call a Minsky moment, which is when they realize they've got all their money exposed to this system, the fossil fuel system, and all of a sudden, climate crisis, cheap competitives coming in, is going to cause a big devaluation in the stocks. And so the point is to reduce exposure to sectors at risk of disruption and invest in companies leading the change to a new energy system, and then lean on companies to change before it's too late.